Sanjeev, thank you so much for coming to Chinmaya Vibhuti.
It's a pleasure.
This is the 13th National Youth Convention we have, and we are very, very happy to have you here to talk to 800 youngsters. Like the earlier session, which you also attended, where Mr. Bana Singhar, Paramveer, and Yogendra Yadav inspired them on what is a soldier's role in the frontiers. But if we have to guard the nation from inside, we also need to be a soldier. And for that, we strongly feel we need to know our history well. Today, what is available as history is quite confusing. So can you tell us something about what we do with the right interpretation of Indian history?
So there's an old African saying that as long as the lions do not have their storytellers, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. And unfortunately, what has happened that despite having been an independent country for some 70 odd years, we have still not telling our story from our perspective. So we have a peculiar situation where we tell our story essentially from a colonial Western perspective. And we have not bothered to correct it. This is partly our own fault. There's no point in blaming the colonial rulers who left so long ago. But the net result of it is that we have ended up imbibing many of their attitudes. So we have ended up seeing ourselves from their perspective. This is unfortunately not uncommon in the rest of the world. There is a very well-known writer called Edward Said who's written about Orientalism, how essentially by taking over the framework in which we see ourselves, we can effectively be permanently colonized, because that is how we see ourselves is not defined by how we see ourselves, but by some way somebody else sees us. And so this has been a major, major problem in our historiography.
See, for example, other day I was talking to children, some 600 kids from the age group of 7 to 12. Where I asked them, who is Baba's son? Everybody said Humayun. Who is Humayun's son? Akbar. Who is Akbar's son? Jahangir. Who is Jahangir's son? Shah Jahan. Who is Shah Jahan's son? Aurangzeb. And they went even to say Bahadur Shah Zafar as Aurangzeb's son. So Mughal history they could say so well. Next I put a question saying, who is Rajaraja Chola's son?
Yes.
Rajendra Chola's son. Silence.
So there are several problems here. You have illustrated this problem, and this is an illustration of coming together of several problems. The first problem is that, unfortunately, after independence, we ended up telling India's story from the perspective of Delhi. So what has happened is that you may know the history of obscure rulers of Delhi, like the Lodhis. But you won't know the history of major empires in the rest of the country.
Correct.
So you won't know about the Satavahanas, the Pallavas, the Chalukyas, the Cholas, which you just mentioned.
Lalitaditya.
Lalitaditya was a major king of Kashmir, but you know, the whole of Northeast is left out. The Ahom kings who ruled over for 600 years over Assam. And forget about the smaller places like Sikkim, or Arunachal, or Goa. Their histories are simply left out of the story. So this is one part of the problem, i.e. a geographical problem. The second major problem is that, as I mentioned, because we see our history from the perspective of somebody else, so we also have imbibed and almost inside ourselves taken on their biases. And I'll give you another example. Now, have you noticed that whenever you read Indian history, we always lose? You know, the 3 battles of Panipat, the Indians lose. The Battle of Plassey, we lose. Battle of Buxar, we lose. So where are the battles in which we won? After all, we are still around. So we must have won some battles in our long history. Where are they in our history? They are not there because they were systematically removed from our history books. So that is why, for example, you hear very little about the resistance to the Mughals, Turks, British and so on. And this, the British simply removed from our history books because it was a way of telling us that we were essentially a slave people, that were not capable of ruling ourselves ever. So let me give you just a few examples. Let's talk about Martanda Varma. Okay? from the southern tip of India. He was the king of Travancore. In fact, he set up them. Now, in the early 18th century, the Dutch were the most powerful maritime force in the world. And the Dutch East India Company, well before the English East India Company, ruled large parts of the world. So what is now Indonesia was Dutch colony. Sri Lanka was a Dutch colony. South Africa was a Dutch colony. And in the early 18th century, they decided that they were going to conquer India. When they came across the king of a very small kingdom, and that king was called Martanda Varma, and he defeated the Dutch in a major battle, in a battle of Kolachar. And as a result of that battle, I am speaking to you in English and not in Dutch.
Okay.
Now, that was not just a great Indian event. It was a world event. Because after that battle, the Dutch went into decline, and the English and French became the most important. So it had an impact on the world history. And after Martanda Varma's victory over the Dutch, till 1905, when the Russians were defeated by the Japanese, no Asiatic power won a war against the European power. So everybody in the world reads the history of 1905, how the Japanese defeated the Russians. That's in Indian textbooks also. But you never hear about the fact that before that, the last time that had happened in the Battle of Kolachar and Martanda Varma. Forget about the rest of the world talking about it. Even in Kerala, people barely know about Martanda Varma. So this is being systematically done. And even when people are mentioned, they are deliberately diminished. And I'll give you another example of it. All our textbooks always say, Samudragupta was the Napoleon of India. You'll all read it in our textbooks. Now, this has been there from colonial times. Now, why Samudragupta is the Napoleon of India? Why is he not, say, the Julius Caesar of India, or the Peter the Great of India, or any number of other great... Yeah, exactly. The reason for that is very simple. The British wanted to essentially tell us that, look, even your best general would have been defeated by us. Because after all, they had in there very proud of the fact that they had defeated Napoleon. So that was the message. Now, that's fine for a colonial government to be making its point that they were in power. Now, 70 years later, the question is, why do we perpetuate this story? We perpetuate it because we have imbibed it to such an extent that we are very, very grateful that some Indian is being compared to a Napoleon. Whereas, far from it, Samudragupta's empire was much bigger than Napoleon's empire. Napoleon's empire collapsed while he was alive. He was defeated repeatedly. Samudragupta's empire, on the other hand, was passed on to his son, Chandragupta Vikramaditya, who expanded it even further. And the Gupta empire lasted for much, much longer than anything the French did. So the point I'm making to you is that this is a systematic bias that is there in our history books. There is absolutely no excuse that 70 years after independence, we should be perpetuating it.
See, maritime history of India, like our entire sea trade was in if we had 32% of global GDP till the first 12th century, and almost 25 or 24% of world GDP even in the 17th century, definitely it is because of India's navy. The sea trade which the Indians established, we had ports in our rivers, etc. But unfortunately, like you started the conversation saying, as long as the hunter writes the history, he's going to glorify the hunter alone.
Yes.
Okay. So similarly, we were told, like Vasco da Gama came here, found a sea route to India. 1,000 years before him, we were doing sea trade.
Absolutely.
Now, where do we bring this kind of information to our history books, to our youth?
You're absolutely right. The Indian history is, to a very large extent, a maritime history. In fact, all these, one part of this Delhi-centric history problem that I mentioned was that you have simply forgotten that most of our history is a coastal history. And that Indian history cannot be understood unless you understand that southern India was trading with Southeast Asia on one coast, and on the other coast trading with the Roman Empire, going back thousands of years, not just recently, thousands of years. Even in the Bronze Age, Gujarat was trading with Mesopotamia. So this is a very, very important part of our understanding who we are. After all, the world's largest Hindu temple is not in India, it's in Cambodia. And what is extraordinary is that other parts of the world remember this. So when you take, for example, the history of Korea. The Korean history in their textbook starts with the marriage of a local prince to a princess from Ayodhya. So they remember our, so you know, when you go to Shaolin and you learn Kung Fu, they start, the history of that place starts with a Bodhidharma turning up and teaching. So there is a lot of this, and along the Chinese coastline there are several old, 1,000-year-old temples. The remains are still there. Some of them were converted into Chinese temples and are still used. So there is so much evidence across the world of Indian trade, mariners of all kinds. Even in India we have records of them. Many of our customs, like Kartik Purnima in Odisha, for example, is clearly related to maritime trade.
Right.
Yes, yet it has been completely wiped out of our historical memory and our textbooks. So your question was, what should we do about it? Now the first and most important thing is that we need to write an authentic history of this. Because you see, there is no benefit of making grand claims which has not been authenticated in a proper scholarly way. And so, while we have known for a long time that our history is contaminated, very little effort had actually been made to correct this. Instead, what has been done is that a lot of ranting happens on, say, social media. A lot of people say, we should do something, but nobody actually goes and does it. And by the way, making grand claims of Vedic flying chariots is not going to solve the problem. There is many good things to know about Indian history. We don't have to make claims of things for which there is no evidence. There has to be properly evidence-based, properly referenced history, which is needed. I have attempted in my small way to do it, although I'm not a historian by training. I have written a few history books. But we now need to do it in a much more systematic way.
My last question to you is, there are a lot of people in India who keep parroting this particular line saying, India was 526 princely states before it got independence. There was never a nation called India. Now, if this is the kind of history which is going to come, then I don't know why the Indian Ocean was called Hindu Mahasagar or Hindu Kush Mountains. And we were always known as Bharat. But yet, what has been put into our heads constantly is saying that we were not a nation.
So this is again a part of that old same colonial history. You have to remember that the British colonial rulers were very clear that they had conquered an ancient civilization. And when they conquered some place like, for example, Australia, they called it terra nullius. Terra nullius means empty land, which meant that the locals had nothing. And therefore, they could be thrown out, exterminated, and their lands could be taken out. Now, when they came to India or a country like India, they couldn't say that nothing existed before. So they tried in various ways to try and diminish us in many ways. And one of them was to make this claim that India had never been a nation. And by the way, it is quite extraordinary how deliberately they did it. There are correspondence between British officials discussing how to go about doing this. So it's not something that they just did. There were discussions, they thought about it systematically. And they basically made this case, yes, they were all small kingdoms. Consequently, they had no sense of being a nation. Now, it is true that India has gone through many cycles. So there have been great empires from time to time, and sometimes they've fallen apart. This does not mean anyway that people didn't have a sense of having a nationhood. And I'll go back to that. After all, people don't say that the Chinese don't have a sense of nationhood. But Chinese history is also full of large empires, and then they're falling apart. The ancient Greeks used to fight each other, Sparta versus Athens all the time. But they had a sense of nationhood. After all, every 4 years they used to stop all their wars and have the Olympic Games. When the Persians turned up, they used to all unite and fight against the Persians. So clearly they had a sense of civilizational nationhood. So the key thing to understand is that Indians have for a very long time had a strong sense of being a civilizational nation. This does not mean that at all points in time that they have to think in terms of Westphalian nation state. That is a Western concept. The idea of being in a civilizational nation is an old one, and we are not even unique in this. The Chinese have a sense of being a civilizational nation. The Japanese have a sense of being a civilizational nation. The Iranians have a sense of being a civilizational nation. In fact, the Israelis are attempting to recreate a civilizational nation. So this is a very old thing. Now, the exact contours of that civilization nation have gone up and down over time. There would have been a time when say Southeast Asia would have been considered a part of that civilizational nation.
Yeah.
The exact borders change, the exact nature of that civilization change. After all, we are an evolving civilization. It's not some sort of pristine civilization. We have absorbed all kinds of things along the way from many people, and they are now, just because we have a problem with colonial rule does not mean I am having this conversation with you in English. What is India now without cricket, for example? So this is now a part of our culture. But that doesn't mean just because we absorb things from outside, we do not have a sense of ourselves. And this is there very clearly mentioned in many of our texts. So Vishnu Puran clearly mentions that there, south of the Himalayas and north of the oceans, live the descendants of the Bharatas.
Right,
and after that, it then describes all the rivers and the mountains of this of this subcontinent. So clearly, there is a very strong sense of what is the civilization and its landscape.
Yeah. So, Sanjeev, I would like to know, what was India called, apart from Bharat? What are the other names of India referred in Greek history or Chinese history?
So it is very important to understand how we came about to call ourselves Bharat and the word India and the word Hindustan and so on. What is the origin of all of this? The origin of this goes back to the Rig Veda. The Rig Veda mentions a small tribe called the Bharatas who lived on the bank of the Saraswati in roughly what is now Haryana.
Okay.
And this tribe was quite interesting because this tribe basically created India's first empire. So it mentions, for example, that this tribe fought a war with the 10 tribes on the banks of the Ravi and defeated them. And then they turned on the other side, on the banks of the Yamuna, they defeated another tribe. And they established the first empire known to us.
Okay.
Now this tribe was called the Bharatas.
Okay.
So this is where we get our name.
Right.
But it was a Haryanavi tribe. Why have we all begun calling ourselves Bharatas? Because the Bharatas did something very, very unique. Having established their empire, most emperors do what? They impose their own civilization on everybody else. They say, I am the king, my God must be the biggest God, now all of you worship my God. But the Bharatas did something absolutely unique. They said, they called all the rishis and thinkers of all the defeated tribes and made them sit together and compiled all their thoughts into what is now the Rig Veda.
Right.
The Rig Veda includes in it the shlokas composed by Vishwamitra and his followers. Now Vishwamitra was the guru of the 10 tribes who were defeated. So in doing that, they created a template of assimilation as opposed to imposition. So Bharata went from being a political construct to becoming a civilizational construct. And that civilizational construct kept expanding. And so, some 5,000–6,000 years later, I am a Bengali. I am not from Haryana, but I belong to this civilization. So I call myself a Bharata.
Okay.
So now, this is a civilizational idea. So the idea of Bharat is a civilization idea. But there is a geographical idea as well. And that geographical idea also comes from the Rig Veda. Because in the Rig Veda, the land, the space area where the Bharatas had the original homeland on the banks of the Saraswati River, they used to call it the Sapta Sindhu, or the land of 7 rivers. Now, that was a geographical idea. Now, this idea spread itself outside. So, in the Zend Avesta, which is a ancient Persian text, which the Parsis still use, it mentions the land of the Hapta Hindu. Sapta Sindhu became Hapta Hindu. So the term Hindu then came to connotate the land of the Bharatas. So as the civilizational expansion, Bharata civilizational expanded, the idea of the Sapta Sindhu or Hindu expanded to the whole subcontinent. So it became a geographical. So the Sapta Sindhu is a geographical term. The idea therefore of India, which was also then become Hindu, then became Indian to the Greeks. Indica and so on. So you can see that that is a geographical term. And of course there is a close link between the two, going back to the beginning, because one, the Bharata tribe and the Sapta Sindhu. So both these ideas are alive today. So when our constitution, the first thing it starts with saying, India, that is Bharat.
Okay, correct.
It mentions both the nation state and the civilization.
Perfect, correct. Thank you, Sanjeev.
Thank you.
It was nice having you here. And to discuss with you on a very, very important topic for the coming generation, to revisit Indian history.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.